Thank you all for coming. We're going to talk about the budget that just passed for 2020 and 2021. You know, there are priorities in budgets, and nothing's more important than the priority being the truth. And the truth is that this budget is $450 million plus in the red. It talks about a deal with the state union employees that is simply non-existent. There is no deal. There's no memorandum. There's no understanding. There is nothing. This governor told the legislators, this governor told the people of the state of Connecticut when he was running and after he was elected, he was going to bring the state employees to the table. And then he sticks in to the budget $450 million savings as if it exists. And it doesn't. And there's no contingency in this budget for what if he does not get that deal. So right now, this budget's out of whack. And what we do know is that Dan Livingston on June 4th said, "We have indicated our willingness to consider win-win changes." That's prospective. We are indicating a willingness. In February of 20, at least he argued, Dan Livingston did, when the issue of givebacks came up, he said, we're willing to continue to work with. Even the February 20th was more strong than the June 4th statement, but neither statement indicates any understanding of a deal. And without a deal, you have a budget deficit of numbers which make this budget unbalanced and, I would argue, unconstitutional. The Democratic leaders also had an obligation. They had an obligation to see the truth. They had an obligation to determine whether or not these union savings were real or not real. I don't know what they told their caucus. It's not my caucus, so I don't know what they told their caucus. But what was voted on was a budget that had a shortfall, still has a shortfall, and someone, some agency, some social service, someone's going to pay for that deficit. Now, I know why we were not included in the meetings. It always was a perplexing problem in my mind. Why wouldn't the governor or the Democrats have us in the meeting? And I think the answer's very simple. They know we would have asked, show me the money. Show me where the savings are. Show me how you got $450 million worth of savings. Where are the documents? But they did this budget in the dark. Because that's the only way this budget could ever pass, is in the dark of night, is when nobody is looking, negotiations in the back room, bringing it to the table, having a shortfall, and not giving anybody the opportunity to know the real numbers. As I said, under Section 18A of Connecticut General Statutes, or the Constitution, I should say, this budget is out of balance and is unconstitutional. Period. Unconstitutional, period. This governor has an obligation to the state of Connecticut and to the people for which he governs. And that obligation means this governor needs to veto this budget because he cannot, under operation of law, under the Constitution of the state of Connecticut, sign a budget which is not constitutional. And he should veto it and bring us back, and we should have a legitimate conversation on how we're going to balance the budget in the state of Connecticut. That's our message to the governor. Are there any questions?
Well, they have the numbers left, so they backed it. What are you going to do about it? They're not going to come back. He's not going to veto it. So,
One, I think it's ripe for a challenge of constitutionality should he sign it. I think someone could take up that challenge. Well, we'll see when it's signed. We'll see what happens. There are groups out there that may challenge it. I don't know. But I think it's subject to a challenge. Number two, I think he has an ethical responsibility to the people of the state of Connecticut not to sign this budget, but to veto it. It's certainly within his discretion, but we'll see what type of governor he wants to be. A governor that's going to put forth a honest, forthright budget, or a governor who wants to sit back and say it's balanced on time, even though he knows it's not a true document. That's going to be a test of the character of this governor, in my view.
But with the burgeoning surplus, it really won't be an issue. I mean, if-
Surplus is gone. Don't forget, the surplus at the end of June is absolutely zero. He has spent it on $160 million for the hospital tax, or the hospital deal,
the current year budget.
current year.
Surplus,
Right.
right.
And we don't know if there's going to be a surplus next year.
Right.
Nobody knows.
So wouldn't by operation of law, as I think I heard someone say, there's more than enough money in the rainy day fund. So at the end of the year, right, if the budget's out of balance, doesn't it automatically get covered out of that rainy day fund? So if
So there's two aspects. There's the budget reserve fund, right? We call it the rainy day fund. You cannot use that money to balance the budget unless you get, right.
I guess
Right.
no
problem. The surplus, if there is, yes, they could use the surplus. Yep.
I follow if they want to use the rainy day fund, they had to appropriate it first. They didn't do that. But if you take the tools that are at the governor's disposal, he has very restricted layoff authority because of the CBAC concession deal of 2017. He has very limited rescissionary power. That's the way it's designed. It's a small budget adjustment tool. And then there's limited holdback authority. Do you believe mathematically, if the union said, no, thank you, we can't reach agreement, he could mathematically balance this budget with the tools at his hand?
No, he cannot, I don't believe. And also, I might add, in this budget, the bipartisan budget said, we said, governor rescission, you cannot touch ECS or municipal aid. Because if you remember, the last time we had a problem, Governor Malloy went after municipal aid and the ECS, and when we did our bipartisan budget, and caused havoc and pressure on municipalities and panic. So we did our bipartisan budget. We said you can't touch those two things. Well, this budget that was passed added a whole list of other things.
Hospital supplemental payments, you can't hold back or rescind those either.
Correct. And now we've added the Children's Medical Center, we added Justice Education Center, Youth Employment Center, Fire Training Schools, Youth Violence Initiative, Youth Services, on and on and on. So now they've taken out of play in fiscal year 20, $2.5 billion he can't touch automatically. And then in 2021, it's $2.57 billion he can't touch. That's excluded from his rescission. So now you've taken more power away from him on rescissions, and these are for pet projects, pet ideas, I would argue, and leaving him less money he can touch, and he still can't use his rescission to that extent under our laws.
One more quick follow to clarify. In 2011, when Governor Malloy had a tentative deal with the unions, but not a ratified deal when we adopted the budget, the 2011 budget had what I would call like a Plan B. It said if the ratification fails, the governor could take the following steps between layoffs and other expanded holdback authority to achieve the lapse. If this budget had that type of language, it would be acceptable to you. If it had a Plan B that said, if the unions say no thanks, but
So-
you can do this, that would be acceptable.
So to Keith's point, and I think you may hear this from the governor's office, so let's be abundantly clear. They're going to bring up a case called Roger Sherman Liberty versus Williams. It was a 2011 case dealing with the Connecticut budget. So what happened was in 2011, some of you were here may recall, a budget was passed around mid-May, and the budget said, we have a handshake deal with the unions. And at that time, Governor Malloy had announced with Dan Livingston that they had a union concession deal and was subject to a union vote, but everybody agreed to the deal at the executive branch and at the unions. The budget was passed, and in the budget it said, we have this deal, it's going to have a union vote. If it gets approved, we enact the deal. If it doesn't get approved, we have a Plan B, and Plan B is OPM Secretary Ben Barnes is going to come up with rescissions. There'll be a special session, and the legislature would adopt those rescissions as part of the budget. In June, at the end of June, the unions, who had to approve it by 80%, didn't get the 80% approval. They got like a approval, the deal died. So Governor Malloy asked for special session, and they had a revote. Many of you recall there was a revote. They changed the rules. We only need a majority, not 80%. Lo and behold, the revote went forward. The deal was accepted. Things were done. In between the bad vote that went down and the good vote that happened, this case popped up. And the court in that case said this. The court said, well, if you look at the budget document, there's a plan B. And the plan B would balance the budget. Therefore, your case is not ripe because it's an ongoing budgeting process. We do not have an ongoing budgeting process. We have one budget that says one thing. We have a union deal for over $450 million. That's going to balance this budget. It hasn't happened. There's no indication that it is going to happen before July 1st. Therefore, that case that they're going to bring up is nowhere near on point with the present situation. This present situation has no plan B. Doesn't exist. Therefore, this budget, in my view, is unconstitutional.
Of someone filing suit. Like in that case, it didn't stop anything, right? I mean, if somebody, if a group did decide to challenge it after July 1, what would happen?
You have to challenge it. The ripeness of it would be clearly after the governor signs, and maybe after July 1. I would argue for ripeness because it could be amended. And you would argue that it's unconstitutional. If a court finds that the document is unconstitutional, it would come back to the legislature for further budgeting approval.
But then the governor would be in charge of steady spending, again, correct?
The governor would be with these short-term resolutions that you could spend as much as last year in particular items, but not more than.
The governor would be in the driver's seat once again,
Yep.
telling us
Like last
how he's
time.
going to spend and what he's
Correct.
going to spend it on and how much will be spent
Yes.
within the parameters you just described.
And the court would order it back to the legislature to
Yes,
try to.
for a redo.
Senator, you were blowing this very same whistle last Tuesday afternoon. If you felt so strongly about it, why did you agree to limit debate Tuesday night?
We didn't limit, well, we had agreed to limit the debate to 6 hours, which is plenty of time to argue on Tuesday, before I found out about this issue. On Tuesday, we talked about limiting 6 hours to debate on the budget.
Before you found out about it.
Yes, and what happened was Tuesday night when we went home, we figured out. But Mark, even if you make the argument can only be made in a half hour. It is what it is, that it's unconstitutional. And just,
Yourself for 24 hours
Excuse
and
me?
gone to pass the deadline.
no, it was Tuesday. We'd have to talk for almost 36 hours. And, my view is to talk 36 hours to kill a budget bill, potentially, and a whole bunch of other stuff that's legitimate business of the Senate and the House probably doesn't make much sense in my view. I mean, you do that, if you recall, when we did the budget back in 2000, and I forgot, Senator Looney was going to call the question. If you remember back then, I'm trying to think what year that was, 2010 maybe. It came up from the House. It was Wednesday. He wanted to stop budget at 10 o'clock. We talked. Senator Looney went to call the question. I asked for a moment to rest, talked to Senator Looney and said, look, I don't think that's appropriate. And clearly you could have. But you don't want to kill a whole bunch of legislation like that. They know what they're doing. They know this is imbalance. It's their obligation to uphold the Constitution, not our obligation to play that game. It's their obligation to uphold the Constitution. And the governor's going to have the last chance of saying the Constitution matters more than a medal on my chest to say, I did this on time. That's the question before this governor that he has before him. Any other questions?
This one's kind of hypothetical, but if we get to July 1 and there's still no tentative deal, can you speak to the leverage issue? I mean, in theory, we don't know what CBAC has asked for, if anything, in exchange for these. They could ask to extend the benefits contract that expires in mid-2027. They could ask to extend the no layoff language that runs through FY21. Does, in your mind, the state's leverage position change once you're basically into a fiscal year and you need looking behind Vinny, $450 million? Does the leverage change as the calendar days tick off?
as a business guy, I cannot believe the governor would have boxed himself in, because that's where we are. We are boxed in. You have a budget that's going to start on July 1, and every day that ticks off is a day less that he could find the savings of $450 million. The leverage clearly is in the union's corner after July 1, because every day that goes by, that's less of a day that you can find savings to make up the 450. If I am on the union side of this, and the governor's coming to me, I'm going to drag my feet. You did a budget. You included savings you don't have. I never agreed to any savings. So now how much do you want from me? And how much is that going to cost you? He's put himself in a box that's just going to be like a vice. Every day after July 1st, one more turn of that crank on that vice. Every day. And if we ever hit what people are talking about as a recession, that vice is going to click faster and faster if we ever get into a recessionary period.
Leverage? I mean, there are, what, 4,000 or so employees that have been
No
hired
layoffs.
since? No. There were no layoffs if you were on the job effective July 28th, 2017. You know, there have been people hired since then. So, you know, at the last administration, I believe they calculated it was what, 1,000 layoffs was $100 million. So, I mean, doesn't he have leverage, one, with the laying off all these people who are not receiving job protection as a result of their hiring dates? And two, wouldn't that be enough to make up the savings?
Well, I would say, number one, I haven't seen this governor take a hard stand on many things in this building. And that's a huge hard stand asking this governor to take.
But, I mean, he does have that leverage, does he not? Does he not?
Theoretically, he could lay off people, yes.
Okay.
I don't know what that savings is, Paul, so I'd get back to you on it. I don't know.
Yeah, well, those were figures that were cited a couple of years ago, so I imagine they're out of date.
Those would be, wouldn't those be also the lowest paid state employees, most of whom would be in the new hybrid retirement plan, the ones you, in theory, don't want to lay off?
Yeah, it's a good point. Agreed. Any other questions?
In simple terms, Senator, explain. The reamortization, of course, is a refinance, like you would refinance your mortgage, right?
So,
And, right?
so there's right.
Yeah.
There are savings. This is in the transportation fund and the
General fund.
The reamortization is where the governor, that's the one where the governor is going to take the existing pension and refinance it like we did in 2017. Spread out more years, and he gets the biggest savings mostly in his years. And then the second part is the undefined healthcare savings are where they were trying to set up this, as I understand it, where certain hospitals would do certain surgeries at a certain rate. So you wouldn't have if you're a state employee, you wouldn't have a pick of any hospital. You'd only go to certain hospitals. And those two are the savings of the general fund and then of the transportation fund and then the final savings.
Both of those things are subject to ratification by the unions and approval by the assembly.
At the very least, the refinance, there's some argument on the health savings because it depends on how far it goes, whether it's a marginal or not. So I don't think, because the negotiations haven't gone far enough, but clearly on the pension, that's a contractual obligation between the unions and the state. So that contract would have to definitely be modified like we did in 17. That has to have union approval first, then to the legislature for legislative approval second.
But it doesn't change the benefit. It only changes
Changes the payments that you're making to the pension
that
plan.
you're putting in.
Right,
Right,
and that also then changes how they finance. So they take that money and they invest it. So you're decreasing the amount of money they're getting, so that you decrease the potential for investment. That's why it's out further, because you got to make up for that lost potential investment. Now they may decide, listen, that's a greater number than what you're putting in there, so we're against it, so we don't want to change the deal. That's for the unions to decide.
Is there any indication that the state comptroller has begun these negotiations over the healthcare savings, or has?
I would tell you that we looked at minutes from healthcare cost containment starting in November. We read every one of those minutes. Melissa Zebron went to the last meeting, and when she was there, they went into executive session. And they never post why they're necessarily in executive session. but I found nothing. And by the way, I go to executive session an awful lot if you go to those meetings. But I found nothing in the minutes that reflect, all but one day, January 14th. January 14th, there was one mention of an RFP, and that was it. And we've checked with OFA, we've checked with the comptroller's office, so we know of nothing that you could speak of that advances that argument. We've checked the agencies that most likely would show this. And once again, Dan Livingston seems to make it pretty clear.
Senator, on another topic, if you don't mind, if everyone's exhausted this, Governor Lamont, a couple of times over the past few days, several times over the past week, has suggested that there's room for compromise with the Republicans on transportation issues.